Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master. Scenic routes sometimes hide horrors that travel guides won't mention. Tonight, I'll tell you stories of road trips where the beauty of the landscape is just a facade for what truly lurks. So, turn off the lights, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and join me on this journey into fear. And if you have a terrifying story to share, send it to the email in the description. You might be the next protagonist of our tales. I was on a long-haul delivery, transporting goods from the East Coast to a company on the West Coast. This cross-country route was one I had taken many times before, having been a truck driver for nearly 20 years. Every trip was pretty much the same. The same roads, the same truck stops, the same routine. In all those years, nothing crazy had ever happened to me. I'd had a few odd scenarios, but they never amounted to anything significant. So, as I was driving this route again, I had no concerns in my mind. It was just another day on the job. About 20 hours into the route, a storm started to brew, slowing down my driving. It was late, so I was already on the lookout for the next truck stop to get some sleep. As I drove, a sudden light appeared behind me. The road I was on was flat and straight, so I should have seen the vehicle coming in my mirror, but suddenly, it was right behind me. Maybe they had just turned on their lights or something, but very quickly, they got close to my trailer. I kept my eyes on them until they got so close they were completely covered by the back of the trailer. All I could see were their headlights reflecting off the rear, and then their lights went out. I maintained my speed and kept checking my mirrors, trying to see if they were still behind me, but I had no way of knowing for sure. Someone turning off their lights in the middle of a heavy storm was crazy, and tailgating so closely was even crazier. Fortunately, a sign indicated that a truck stop was just 5 miles ahead, so at least I knew I was close to getting away from whatever this was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on just one weird behavior, but as a trucker, it's hard not to think about the possibility of a robbery attempt, especially when you're alone on the road at night. I closed the door and finally felt a bit of relief. I grabbed my pillow and blanket from the passenger side, locked the doors, turned off the truck, and tried to get some sleep. The rain pounding on the metal roof made it easy to fall asleep, drowning out any potential sounds of other trucks coming and going. However, when I woke up, it felt like I had only slept for a few minutes. I looked around, seeing it was still dark, and the storm was just as fierce, if not worse. But before I could check my mirrors, a loud bang shook the truck. I opened my eyes wider, reached for the door handle, and looked towards the back of the trailer through the rain. I could barely make out the silhouette of a car with its headlights off and 2 men moving around it. Terrified, I hesitated to get out and confront them. As I sat there in that moment of indecision, the door suddenly slammed shut against my body, pushing me back into the driver's seat. Another man was outside, shouting at me to stay put, before slamming the door shut again. His right hand was tucked into his hoodie, and with 2 other men behind the truck, I wasn't in a position to try anything. I could feel the truck shaking as I stayed in my place, with the guy outside my door watching my every move. He didn't take his eyes off me for even a second. This went on for a few minutes before they ran back to their car and drove off. I was still in shock as I watched their car disappear down the road. I called the police and filed a report, but no information ever came up about who the men were. All I know is that if I had been a little less alert and tried to drive away at the first sight of the men, I probably wouldn't have gotten out as safely as I did. It was a typical Friday. After my university classes ended, I spent the evening doing DoorDash. This was my usual routine, working weekends to help cover my living expenses while on campus. The night started well, completing many orders and earning a decent amount of money. Then came a lull. After the dinner rush, very few orders were coming in, and the ones that did were low-paying, not worth my time. After an hour of aimless driving, a somewhat decent order finally came through. It was 8 miles away, but the pay was reasonable. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was worth taking compared to the other offers. I accepted the order, picked up the bag from the restaurant, and got back into my car. The map estimated a 30-minute drive, the longest delivery I'd done so far. Most of my deliveries were near the campus, since anything beyond 15 to 20 minutes was practically empty fields. As I reached the 20-minute mark, the surroundings became sparse. Few houses, mostly distant farmhouses, and nothing else. The last 10 minutes of the trip were on this empty road, flanked by fields. Then I arrived at the house. A dirt road connected to the main road, leading through a large field to a small house in the distance. Driving across the field felt eerie. Although I'm not one to get nervous without reason, this felt different. The only sound was the low hum of my car on the dirt. I parked in front of the house, grabbed the bag, and left the car running as I stepped out. The night was quiet, and the house was dark, with only the porch light on. I walked across the unkempt lawn and up to the porch, knocking on the door. As I waited, I glanced at my car, sitting in the darkness with the pitch-black field behind it. A moment passed, and I knocked again, but there was no answer, not even a sound from inside. It didn't take long to realize how strange the situation was. There were no lights on in the windows, and the house looked run down up close. The only thing that made me think it wasn't abandoned was the fact that I had an order for this address, and the porch light was on. I looked at the light, wondering why it was the only one on. But then I recognized the top of the casing with a cheap solar battery. It was just an automatic light that charges during the day and turns on at night, meaning no one had to be there to turn it on. Just as I was piecing this together, I heard an engine behind me. I turned to see a car driving up the dirt road, stopping right behind my car. I stood there, staring at its headlights until a man stepped out. I shouted from the porch, asking if it was his order, but he didn't respond. He just stood next to his car, unmoving and silent. A surge of adrenaline hit me as I realized how bad this situation probably was. The silence of the night only reminded me that no one was around to help. I was trapped in the middle of a field between an empty house and a stranger. In a split second, I reacted instinctively, dropping the bag and running off the porch into the grassy field. I glanced back and saw the man coming after me frantically. I kept running, and the further I went, the thicker and taller the grass became, until it obscured all views of direction. By then I knew the guy had no chance of catching up to me. I slowed down, catching my breath while carefully moving through the crops, trying to be quiet in case he was still looking for me. Eventually, I reached another person's yard, and from there found a road where I had enough signal to call for help. The police picked me up and went to check my car, but of course, the man was gone. However, I was surprised that my car hadn't been ransacked, and the food bag was still on the porch of the abandoned house. This only meant that the man had other intentions, probably much worse than simply robbing me. 2 years ago, one of my closest friends, Tom, moved with his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, for a job opportunity he couldn't pass up. The only hitch was that he didn't want to fly his dogs during the move, since they'd be staying in a hotel for the first month. He was also hesitant about flying the dogs due to health concerns for both pets. By the time they found a rental house, he was already missing his furry babies and asked his sister, Liz, another close friend, Mike, and me to bring them to Los Angeles. We're from Chicago, so it would be a long trip. However, with the three of us sharing the nearly 30-hour drive, it would be a piece of cake. We left early and drove for many hours. During the journey, Mike and I decided to take turns driving, and if necessary, let Liz drive a bit. We were in a hurry due to a problem with the rental contract, so we didn't have the luxury of stopping often, except for an 8-hour stay at a La Quinta Inn in Denver. As for the trip itself, it was relatively smooth, except for getting pulled over just before entering Utah for driving 2 miles in the left lane of an empty highway. Oops. From there, we passed through Utah, Arizona, and Nevada without many issues until we got to California and needed gas. I had been driving most of the first day and relieved Mike after we got pulled over. I stayed in the passenger seat as the navigator, looking for a gas stop on the GPS. We kept our eyes open for road signs and found one that pointed to Raven Ghost Town, or something like that, which had a mobile gas station. What a relief. Plus, it was conveniently located just off the interstate. We arrived with barely any gas left. As we pulled up to the pumps, we normally let the dogs out at every rest stop, but since we had stopped not long ago, and both dogs were sleeping comfortably in the back, I decided to fill up without anyone else getting out of the vehicle. Mike parked on the opposite side of a beat-up green sedan with a short, stocky gentleman who had just walked into the store. I noticed some other old cars at the pumps, all unoccupied, and there were a couple more cars parked near the station, probably belonging to the employees. So nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I slid my credit card into the pump, and it displayed, "Try again." I tried swiping it again, and the pump showed, "Please see attendant." Annoyed, but needing gas, I tapped on the window and told Mike what I was going to do and asked if they needed anything. After taking their orders for Gatorade and Marlboro Reds, I walked toward the store, mentally noting how odd this gas station seemed. It was eerily quiet, especially for being right off the interstate. However, upon entering, things got even stranger. The first thing I noticed was a few boxes of chips scattered on the floor, as if someone had been stocking shelves and just abandoned the task. Turning to my right, I immediately saw that there was no one milling around this place. With the 6 cars plus mine outside, I felt like I should see someone. Things got even weirder when I realized there was no one behind the counter, no customers, no workers. Then I remembered the gentleman who had been at the pump next to mine. Surely they all couldn't be in the bathroom. This is where I started to feel a knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I've always been someone who trusts their instincts, and those instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I wanted to run, but I held back. It would look suspicious to run out of an empty gas station. So, I decided to play it cool, not letting my body language reveal how scared I was. In my head, I was probably in this gas station for just a couple of minutes. When I stepped out, I paused just before exiting to listen for anything at all. A flushing toilet would have been a welcome sound, but there was nothing. As I exited the store and saw my car, a sense of dread started to creep in. It's like that moment in a movie where the hero is about to finish their trial, but the celebratory fanfare stops, and in that silence, something comes and knocks them down. I was about 75 feet from the car when I saw a man emerge from the opposite side of the store. This wasn't the same man I saw while fueling up. He was larger and had a peculiar expression on his face. The best way to describe it would be like Nick Cage's smile in Face Off before the titular act. I continued walking toward my car, but when I glanced back, he was now walking toward me with purpose. At this point, I picked up the pace toward the car with more urgency. And of course, Mike had the car door locked like a complete idiot. Additionally, the 100-pound golden retriever was in my seat. Apparently, my travel companions didn't notice how scared I was or the creepy guys still walking in my direction. I banged on the window, telling them to unlock the door, to which they only rolled the window halfway down to tell me the dog was in my seat, and they were afraid she'd jump out if they opened the door. I reached in and pushed the dog into the back seat as hard as I could, while my friend noticed how frightened I was. He started the car and sped off quickly. I took one last look and saw Nick Cage's doppelganger stop one pump away from where we had been, still with that same expression on his face. We found another gas station further down the road, this time with plenty of people inside and out. After scaring my friends with the story while we refueled, we headed back to the interstate, which meant passing that gas station again. It had been about 15 minutes since we initially left, and we fell silent as we noticed those same cars still in the same spots where we had left them. After freaking out for a few miles, I received a call from my credit card company about a $100 charge at a mobile station. The lady on the phone was very helpful in resolving the issue for me and was just as spooked by the situation as we were. In the end, we made it to Los Angeles and had a great vacation, but it still haunts me to think about what the hell was going on at that little roadside gas station and who that smiling man was. I thrive on adventure. I've traveled across almost every state, experiencing the rich diversity of nature and people. My main drive for these journeys is to explore the wild. Often I hike through rugged mountains, drive through national parks, and traverse vast deserts. Growing up on the East Coast, I didn't have much exposure to the desert, so I've developed a preference for desert travels over mountainous ones. I've been doing this for a few years now, and aside from the intense feeling of solitude, I haven't encountered anything too bizarre in the desert. My favorite time to drive through the desert is at night, when the stars illuminate the landscape majestically. However, about a month ago, I saw more than just sand and stars. On this particular trip, I was driving through the desert in New Mexico as night began to fall. The sunset over the desert transported me to another world. Sometimes I even camped in my car, because in a way, I loved the solitude. Normally I would take my dog with me, but my parents were in town, so this time I was completely alone. As nightfall approached, I debated whether to camp or continue driving home. I figured my parents would want to see me, and I was only an hour away, so I decided to keep driving through the rapidly darkening desert. For those of you who've driven through the desert in New Mexico, you know it's not uncommon to see horses or other animals by the roadside. So seeing figures by the side of the road in the middle of nowhere wasn't out of the ordinary. About 45 minutes from home, my high beams caught a different figure. It looked like a person. Being the kind-hearted person I am, I stopped to check if they needed help. As I approached, I noticed the figure wasn't moving at all, just sitting upright, seemingly unaware of my presence. Their head never turned. "Are you okay?" I called out. There was no response or acknowledgement. The person was poorly dressed, quite pale, but surprisingly clean-shaven. However, he was unusually thin, and the closer I looked, the more I noticed how abnormally gaunt he was. "I was driving by and noticed you. I wanted to make sure you were all right," I said again. Still nothing. He was staring at the ground. I stood there awkwardly for a few seconds until I finally saw his jaw move. "I need water," he said. His voice was deep, not like a normal person's. I can't explain it well, but it just sounded off. "All right, man. Let me get you some from my car." I walked over to the passenger door and reached for my water bottle. However, before I could grab it, I sensed something was wrong. I quickly turned my head towards where the man had been sitting. He was gone. Now in a panic, I had no idea where he had gone. I shut the passenger door and looked around quickly. I heard movement behind a rock about 10 to 20 feet from the road. A man emerged from behind the rock, but it wasn't the same man. This guy looked absolutely deranged and was holding something in his hand. He started running toward me. I jumped into my car and sped off down the road. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I saw more of them, maybe 5 or 6, all emerging from behind rocks by the roadside. They all stared at me as I sped away. I had no intention of stopping. In fact, I would have been relieved if a cop had pulled me over. Within 3 or 4 minutes, I felt calm enough to turn on some music. I took one last look in the rearview mirror. My blood turned to ice when I saw the man I had offered water to sitting in my back seat, just staring at me. His eyes weren't looking at me, but through me. Naturally, I slammed on the brakes, too shocked to make any noise. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Then he started to smile. The face of death was on his features. "Soon you will be one of us," he said, raising his knife. I jumped out of my car, and as soon as I did, I heard my rear door open. This man was incredibly fast, inhumanly fast. and I knew I couldn't outrun him for long. "Are you ready?" the deep voice said as he quickly approached me. It was now completely dark, and I had no idea where to go. I thought I was done for. Headlights approached from a distance. At that moment, I was about a quarter of a mile from my car. I no longer heard the man behind me. I flagged down the approaching car. Thank God, the driver saw me and stopped. After explaining to him what had happened, he tried to call the police, but unfortunately, there was no signal. His name was Mark, and he agreed to follow me home in case anything else happened. He also had a gun, which made me feel much safer. After about 35 minutes of driving with Mark behind me the entire way, I finally reached home. After thanking him, I went to check the back seat of my car to see if my belongings were still there, or if the man had left anything. Luckily, everything was still there. However, I noticed a piece of paper on top of my backpack. I picked it up and unfolded it. "You are not safe. Soon you will be one of us," the note read. A chill ran down my spine. The sound of footsteps in front of my car startled me, and I jumped up. The dog threw up, my mom said, standing right in front of my car. I went inside without saying anything to my parents. They probably wouldn't have believed me anyway. I thought about calling the police and telling them what had happened. After my parents left, "Oh yeah, some guy was looking for you about 20 minutes ago," my mom said. "Who?" I asked. "I don't know. He was a thin guy with a very deep voice. He didn't say much but gave me this letter for you. So here it is. But please try to make more normal friends." My heart raced. As soon as my parents left, I opened the letter. "We know where you live," the note read. My heart sank. After calling the police and explaining everything, they investigated for a while, but unfortunately found no signs of people along the stretch of road I had been on. I gave them the letter for DNA testing, but I haven't heard back yet. I installed a security system in my home and haven't had any problems since, and I pray it stays that way. This happened when I was 18, driving from my hometown to my new university. I had all my belongings stuffed in the trunk and back seat of my cheap sedan. This wasn't just my first long solo road trip, but also my first time being away from my family for an extended period, so my nerves were running high. The directions I was following indicated the total distance was about 600 miles, which I split into 2 days of driving. I was taking the route suggested by the map and estimated I would reach the hotel by 11 p.m. However, with possible traffic, gas stops, and meal breaks, I knew I would probably arrive much later. By 7 p.m., the sun had set completely, and most of the cars had disappeared. Occasionally, a car would pass, and I'd see its headlights slowly fade in front of me. But for most of the trip, I was alone. This solitude made me feel very tired and bored. Around 10 p.m., I decided to stop at the next service station before making the final stretch of the journey. About 10 minutes later, I exited the highway and pulled into a service station. It was in the middle of nowhere. There was no town or anything nearby, just a few pumps and a small convenience store. I didn't see any other cars on the road or in the parking lot, not even lights from houses or buildings in the distance. I parked right at a pump and got out to start filling my tank. As I looked around, I was almost startled by a man approaching me. Compared to me, he was much older, probably in his 50s if I had to guess, and honestly, he looked like a vagrant. But being approached out here wasn't something I expected, and his brief smile didn't make me feel any more comfortable. "Hello, do you need anything?" I asked, hoping he wouldn't come any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and looked around almost cautiously before responding, "Take the exit back to the highway." I looked at him, confused, not sure if I understood him correctly. He pointed behind me toward the exit I had just taken and repeated, "Take the exit back to the highway." After a second, I said, "Okay," and the man walked away. But I was still really confused. The exit I had just taken, which he wanted me to take again, was a one-way road, so according to his logic, he wanted me to drive on the wrong side of the road and make a U-turn back onto the highway. It just didn't make sense. I looked toward the entrance ramp, the obvious way I was supposed to go, and there were no signs of any construction or anything blocking it. It looked like a normal ramp back onto the highway. As I replaced the pump and got back into my car, I glanced toward the man who was now sitting against the side of the convenience store. The more I thought about it, the crazier that man seemed for sitting out here saying nonsensical things. I thought maybe this was some kind of trap or something, so I followed my gut and exited the parking lot toward the highway entrance. As I merged onto the highway, I realized practically all the streetlights were off. I slowed down, thinking it might be a construction zone or something. I kept my eyes focused on the road directly ahead, being cautious of anything unusual. But as I drove along the unlit road, I saw a brief silhouette of a figure to my left before a truck appeared out of nowhere and stopped right in front of my car. All the doors opened as 4 men jumped out and started running toward my car, holding all sorts of weapons. Metal bats, machetes, knives. They weren't even wearing anything to cover their faces. They just had this emotionless look, as if they felt nothing about what they were doing. I quickly started reversing as they got within a few feet of my windows, and once I backed away far enough, I suddenly saw the silhouettes of dozens of people emerging from the shadows along the roadside. Some even tried to chase my car as I frantically backed away. As soon as I could, I turned around and sped off. I called 911 once I felt safe, but for some reason, I never got a call back. No update on the situation. Almost as if they hadn't even checked it out. Ironically, it was the creepy old man at the service station who tried to keep me out of that danger. Or at least, that's what I assume he was doing. Either way, I was incredibly lucky to get out of that alive, as I have no idea what that was or what they were planning to do. I was driving along Interstate 70, crossing Colorado on my way to Utah. It was a sunny day, one of those days when you feel free and full of energy. I was on a road trip to visit an old friend living in Salt Lake City. After months of non-stop work, I decided to take a vacation, thinking a road trip would be the best way to clear my mind and enjoy the scenery. I had been driving for several hours when my stomach began to growl, reminding me that I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. I decided to look for a gas station where I could refuel and grab something to eat. It didn't take long to find a small service station by the side of the road. It was one of those lonely gas stations in the middle of nowhere, with a small store attached where they sold everything from snacks to road maps. I parked by one of the gas pumps and started filling up the tank. As I did, I noticed a black car, a rather large sedan, pull up to the pump next to mine. 3 men got out of the car. They were burly guys with serious faces, dressed casually, but something about their behavior made me uneasy. They seemed too alert, as if they were on high alert. I watched as they headed into the store. One of them looked around before entering, which struck me as odd, but I tried not to give it too much thought. I continued filling my tank, and when I finished, I headed into the store to buy something to eat and pay for the gas. As I walked toward the entrance, I heard a strange noise coming from the trunk of the black car. It was a banging sound, followed by what sounded like desperate murmurs. I stopped in my tracks, trying to understand what I was hearing. I moved a little closer, making sure the men weren't nearby, and then I heard it more clearly. A muffled voice, almost unintelligible, as if someone was trying to scream, but had something covering their mouth. The sound sent chills down my spine. The banging continued, accompanied by those murmurs, which were now clearly from someone in distress. My heart was pounding. I couldn't just stand there doing nothing, but I also couldn't confront those men. So I decided to discreetly walk away. I went into the store, bought a sandwich and a bottle of water, and while paying, I asked to borrow the cashier's phone, claiming I had forgotten mine in the car. Pretending to call a friend, I dialed 911. I spoke quietly, trying not to attract the attention of the men still in the store. I explained to the operator what I had heard and where I was. She advised me not to do anything risky and to stay away from the black car. She promised to send the police immediately. I hung up and thanked the cashier for letting me use his phone. I left the store, trying to stay calm, and walked back to my car. I drove slowly to the gas station exit, watching my rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't being followed. As I pulled away, I saw the 3 men leave the store, get into their car, and drive off. My heart was still racing, but I felt slightly reassured that they didn't seem to have noticed my call. I continued driving down the road, trying to keep my speed and focus on the road. A few minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw 2 police cars approaching at high speed. I felt a moment of relief, but also growing anxiety. What if the men realized they were being followed? What would they do? The police cars sped past me, and I watched them accelerate toward the black car, which was several miles ahead of me. I kept driving, maintaining a safe distance while keeping an eye on what was happening. The road became straighter, and I could see the flashing lights of the police cars pursuing the sedan. Suddenly, I saw a flash of lights and heard a loud crash. I slowed down and approached cautiously. In the distance, I saw that the black car and the 2 police cars had collided. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol cars illuminated the scene. My heart was pounding as I got closer. I stopped at a safe distance and watched as the police officers approached the black car with their weapons drawn. One of the officers opened the trunk of the sedan, and what I saw took my breath away. There was a young woman inside, completely sedated and gagged. My mind raced with questions and imaginings about what could have happened if I hadn't called the police. The officers pulled the girl out of the trunk and took her to a safe place. The 3 men were handcuffed and put into the police cars. I stood there, watching, unable to move. Finally, an officer approached me and asked if I had seen anything. I told him everything that had happened at the gas station and how I had heard the noises coming from the trunk. The officer thanked me and said they had received my call just in time. After a few minutes, the officers told me I could continue my journey. I got back into my car, still in shock, and continued driving. The images of what had happened kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't heard those noises. I arrived in Salt Lake City later than expected, but grateful to have arrived safely. I spent the next few weeks thinking about the girl and the intentions of those men. I never found out what they were planning, but one thing was certain: that trip had changed me forever. Since then, I've been much more cautious on my road trips. The experience taught me to be more aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts. We never know who might be on the other side of the road and what their true intentions are. And although I love the freedom of traveling, I will always remember that day when a terrifying encounter at a lonely gas station showed me how vulnerable we can be. The highway stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of asphalt, the setting sun casting long shadows over the landscape. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road broken only by the occasional car passing by. My destination was still hours away, but I was determined to push through the night and make it there without stopping. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of static and old rock songs that did little to keep me awake. My eyelids grew heavy, and I considered pulling over for a quick nap when I saw something up ahead, a flicker of light on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a group of people standing next to a barricade made of old tires and wooden planks, blocking the road. They were waving their arms, signaling for me to stop. My heart skipped a beat, and a sense of unease washed over me. Something about the scene didn't feel right. I slowed down but kept my distance, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe they were stranded and needed help, or maybe it was something else, something more sinister. I scanned the area for any signs of danger, but the road was deserted, the only light coming from the fading sun and my headlights. One of the men stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap. He waved again, more urgently this time. I hesitated for a moment longer, then decided to stop. I rolled down my window just enough to hear him. "Hey, buddy, can you give us a hand?" His voice was gruff, and I noticed the others behind him were shifting nervously, their eyes darting back and forth. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're having some car trouble," he said, pointing to an old beat-up truck parked on the side of the road. "Need some help getting it started. Could you give us a jump?" I glanced at the truck, then back at the man. Something about his demeanor felt off. His smile was too wide, his eyes too sharp. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, but I didn't want to be the guy who left someone stranded on the side of the road. "Sure, I'll help," I said, trying to sound casual. I pulled over to the side of the road, but I didn't get out of the car. Instead, I reached for my phone, pretending to check for a signal. The man walked closer, leaning into my window. "No need for that, buddy. Just pop the hood, and we'll take care of the rest." I nodded, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw one of the others pulling something out of the back of the truck, a length of chain, glinting in the fading light. My pulse quickened, and I realized with a jolt of fear that I was in trouble. I needed to get out of there, fast. "Actually, I just remembered I've got an appointment I can't miss," I said, forcing a laugh. "Maybe next time." Before he could respond, I rolled up the window and threw the car into gear. The man's expression darkened, and he reached for something in his pocket. My heart pounded as I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the barricade. In my rearview mirror, I saw the men scrambling to move the barricade, their faces twisted with anger. One of them threw something at the car, a rock or a piece of debris that bounced off the back window. I kept my foot on the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road ahead was dark, and I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I drove faster and faster. The memory of their faces, their angry shouts, haunted me, but I didn't dare slow down. The darkness closed in around me, the road narrowing as it wound through the countryside. I thought I was safe when I saw the flicker of lights ahead, relief washing over me as I realized it was a gas station. I pulled in, my hands still shaking as I parked the car, and ran inside. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. I tried to catch my breath, my voice shaky as I told him what had happened. He listened, nodding slowly, his expression growing more serious by the second. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "There have been reports of people setting up fake barricades on the road to rob drivers. You're lucky you got away." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just car trouble. I thanked the clerk and bought a coffee, my hands still trembling as I took a sip. As I sat there in the brightly lit gas station, the terror of what could have happened weighed heavily on me. The road outside seemed darker than before, more threatening. I knew I had to keep driving, but the thought of getting back on the highway filled me with dread. I finished my coffee and got back in the car, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I drove away from the gas station, I kept a wary eye on the road, my nerves on edge, with every shadow that crossed my path. The night stretched on, but I never stopped again. The memory of the barricade on the road stayed with me, a chilling reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I drove through the night, praying I wouldn't see another flicker of light on the side of the road.
My trucking route takes me from Connecticut down to Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a journey where I get to see almost all the sights the East Coast has to offer. But there's one area of the country that gets pretty wild, and that's around the Appalachian Mountains. You probably know it's one of the poorest regions in the country, really hit hard when coal mining jobs started to decline and the local economy tanked. I genuinely feel for the people there. Seeing how deeply rooted poverty is in some of these families is just heartbreaking. I was passing through a part of the state I hadn't been through before because my usual highway section was blocked by a major traffic accident that unfortunately left some people dead. I was having trouble navigating the roads after my phone died, and believe it or not, my charger also decided to fail at the worst possible time. But I'm an experienced truck driver, and I wasn't driving an 18-wheeler on this trip, so I was free to take some of the smaller roads to find my way. Despite being pretty good with roads, I found myself completely lost at one point and started worrying about missing my delivery deadline. That would mean disciplinary procedures and such, and I simply couldn't afford that at all. Anyway, I saw a guy walking along the roadside, so I slowed my truck, rolled down the window, and asked him for directions. The guy seemed friendly enough and was more than willing to take a few minutes to give me all the information I needed about getting back to the main highways heading south. But then I asked if there was any place nearby where I could grab lunch, since it was getting close to 1 p.m., and I'd only managed to have a pretty skimpy breakfast. The guy seemed to think for a minute, scratching his head and taking an unusually long time to answer a question that usually takes just seconds to answer. It's rare to be anywhere in West Virginia where there isn't a Cracker Barrel a few miles away, so why he didn't point me in the direction of one of those was beyond me. When I pressed, he told me he knew of a family place that served the best fried chicken in the whole county, maybe even the state. Suddenly, all was forgiven. I might be a northerner, but I'm not so foolish as to turn down good fried chicken. What was taking him so long was that he was trying to remember the best way to get there without taking an old, poorly maintained dirt road, one that might get my truck stuck, which would have really stranded me. So, after a minute, he gave me some pretty detailed directions to an old shopping mall. He said it was mostly abandoned, but that restaurant was still there, along with some other small businesses, and not to pay any mind if the place looked quiet during lunch, since they did most of their business in the late afternoon and evening. I was satisfied, thanked the guy, and then set off, following the directions he'd given me. It took me a bit to find the old shopping mall he was talking about. Honestly, it was a little frustrating passing by a couple of chain restaurants and such, given how hungry I was. But man, if I wasn't craving that country-style fried chicken, and if it was a family place, even better. Chain restaurant food just doesn't compare to real home cooking. But eventually, I found this rundown old mall he mentioned, and it was no wonder the place was in such a state of disrepair. It was way off any major highway, with absolutely no signage indicating it was there. Literally nothing to let anyone know it was there. But worst of all, I didn't see any sign that there was any kind of restaurant open in any of the units. I wasn't willing to give up so easily, though, as I saw a place that had a big sign over it that said something like Mama J's Kitchen, or some variation of that, so my hopes were restored. That's when I saw a guy open the door to the place, step out into the afternoon heat, and look towards my truck. I signaled to him from the driver's side, delighted that I was finally going to get some decent food on what had been a long, lonely drive from Connecticut. I figured he hadn't seen me signal, that the sun was blocking his vision or something, just because he kept staring at me. Anyway, I got out of my truck, locked the doors, and started walking towards the restaurant. I called out to the guy when I was halfway across the parking lot, asking if they were really open. Again, the guy didn't react, just kept staring at me in a way that I now noticed was distinctly unwelcoming. Something in my gut told me to stop walking. I felt an unsettling sensation all over my body, like something was telling me something was terribly wrong with this whole situation. Just as I started to feel distinctly vulnerable, the guy reached behind his back, pulled something from his rear pocket, and put it on his head. At first I thought it was a wool hat, but then he pulled it down, and it was a ski mask. I then noticed another thing in his hand, a small revolver. I turned around and started running back to the truck, and as I did, I saw a few other guys emerging from the dilapidated units, each running towards my truck to try and cut me off. Each had some sort of weapon in hand, either a knife or an iron bar, and seeing that just made me run even faster. Thank God I had that gut feeling when I did. Otherwise, they would have definitely reached my truck before I did. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and locked the cab behind me, trembling as I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. The thugs surrounded my truck cab, banging on the chassis with their weapons, demanding I get out. Then the guy with the gun pointed it directly at my face through the windshield, shouting at me to get out of the truck. I had no choice but to do what I did. I started the engine and rammed them all, knocking down those who didn't jump out of the way in time. I ducked in the seat as I grabbed the wheel, really on pure instinct, and again I thank God I did, because as I hit the guy with the gun, he fired a single shot that shattered the windshield and hit the seat just above my head. I swung the truck around the parking lot, expecting another shot any second, but only the thugs who had jumped out of my initial ram of the truck were chasing me. 2 or 3 were just lying on the concrete, writhing in pain as they clutched their limbs. I think that's the only thing that saved me, having the presence of mind to ram them instead of trying to reverse. If that had been my choice, I might not be here to tell you all this. I sped out of that parking lot, blindly speeding in the first direction I could, until I found a safe place to pull over and call the police. The sheriff's deputy I spoke with told me to stop by the department when I could to give a statement, and I did, but not until I managed to get myself some lunch. Not even the terror of almost being kidnapped could curb my appetite. I guess that makes me sound pretty fat or whatever, but you need to appreciate how hungry I was. When I got to the department, however, I learned that I wasn't the first trucker to encounter these thugs. I'd been unlucky enough to ask for directions from one of their accomplices, who directed me to the abandoned mall just before calling his friends to let them know I'd be there. At least, that's the only conclusion we came to once I described the guy I asked for directions. The deputy sheriff just nodded knowingly when I described the guy's physical appearance. I guess I'm just warning you to be very, very careful when you're on the road, and though it might seem like an old, tired, cautionary tale from your aunt who posts on Facebook, be wary when talking to strangers. There's no telling who they really are.
So, who's rethinking their next road trip? Just remember, not all roads lead home. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay on track with our spine-chilling stories. New videos every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. EST. If you've got a story from the road that haunts you, send it in. I'll share it with our fearless audience. This is your Fear Master, signing out.